Good morning. Welcome to the April 2016 meeting of the CalSTRS Board. Staff, could you take the roll, please, first, please?
Ms. Paquin for the State Controller. Here. Mr. Unterman.
Here.
Ms. Dillon. Here. Mr. Boykin for the State Treasurer. Here. Ms. Hendricks. Here. Ms. Vargas. Here. Mr. Rosensteel. Here. Ms. Zumont for the Superintendent of Public Instruction. Ms. Ortega for the Director of Finance. And Ms. Higa. Chairperson Keeley, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Before we begin our meeting, I just want to inform the public and the members of our audience, as well as to inform my colleagues on the board, that we are going to begin a new practice here at CalSTRS, much like which is used in other public agencies, including the legislature. We will have a timer. I'm told that it's a beautiful timer.
Why we just practice this once?
That will appear
An elaborate timer.
on the screen when public comments are being made.
There it goes.
The comments will
You've got
be limited,
2 minutes, 58 seconds left.
right, to,
Harry, get going, Harry.
to 3 minutes, and those 3 minutes will apply to all public comments, including our special friends. They too get 3 minutes. It's kind of like the dinner table. Everyone gets to talk, but it'd be 3 minutes. So we're hoping that this practice will improve efficiency, at the same time embracing public comments and making an appropriate time and place in our agenda for people to address us from the public, but to do it in a manner which is fair and allows for an efficient running of our meeting. So that will be there. So thank you for that. To item 1 of the agenda is the approval of the board agenda. Entertain a motion for approval.
So moved.
It's been moved and properly second to approve the board agenda. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Item number 2, we do this on an annual basis in April, and that is the annual election of our board chair and vice chair. I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Enos, our CEO. Jack?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as was indicated, your policy provides for an annual election of these 2 officer slots, and then you proceed to, as you can see, embedded in this item is your getting your thinking on what committees you'd like to serve on, and then that happens in the next meeting after this. So we start out by taking any motions for the chairman's slot. So nominations are open. If I could see Mr. Keeley.
Thank you, Ms. Enos. I going to, at this point, nominate someone who I think, and it's been great to be your chair. It's been a truly honor, and I've had a lot of fun doing it as well, and hopefully I've done a good job representing our fund, and it's been a lot of fun. But I've had enough airtime in this seat for the last couple of years, and I can't think of anyone who is more deserving to resume this seat than our most senior teacher on our board, the person that has the deepest relationship with our most important stakeholders, the members of the organization, and a longtime dear friend of mine and a great person, Miss Dana Dillon. I would put her name into nomination to chair of the board.
Thank you very much. And the nominations don't require a second in the process you use. So at this point, I would ask if there are any other nominations for chair of the board. Seeing none, we would entertain a motion to close. A motion by Mr. Boykin, and motions are closed. All in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Congratulations, Ms. Dillon. There you go. And if I could, Mr. Keeley, I would like to, on behalf of the organization, thank you for the years you've put into this. You've been a very interesting chair, I have to say, because I'll be honest here, even though we're on tape and webcasting, because it is, it's always a fear of management that boards have difficulty with the boundary between the policy-making functions of a board and the management responsibilities of staff. And to the extent those boundaries get clouded or there's friction there, that makes it hard for us to do our jobs. You've been incredibly interesting as a chair, I found, because you've been able to balance that boundary so well of being a fully engaged chair, active on the issues, getting us to think about things that we hadn't thought about before, but also do it within the realm of being a board member and not being a member of management. And that is incredibly difficult to find that balance and to add energy to the organization and not just the staff saying, oh my gosh, they're adding more to my plate. I got to do more. It's more on the work plan, more time. And that's what I really appreciate the time you spent with us. You've added positive energy, get us to think more progressively about issues and made it a better organization for our members. So I want to thank you very much.
It came at exactly the right time. It's exactly what he needed at the right time, and people saw in me what I didn't see in myself, and I appreciate the vote of confidence, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Next, I need to do the election for the vice chair as well. So again, nominations are open for that position, and Ms. Dillon. Okay. Nomination for Sharon Hendricks to continue as vice chair. Are there any other nominations people would like to make? Seeing none, would we have a motion to close?
Motion to close.
Motion by Mr. Boykin. All in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Congratulations.
Thank you.
Continue on. Great. So I defer to you, Mr. Gilly, if you'd like to continue chairing, or Dan, if you're ready to
Well,
I told him it was.
we'll pass the gavel over to Ms. Dillon to chair today's meeting. Before we, and she can come over here, we'll do this whole transfer. But I would like to recognize my friend and colleague, Ms. Hendricks. She's been a terrific vice chair. It's been wonderful to get to know her as a fellow teacher and educator. We're kindred spirits in so many ways. She's taught me a lot. We've learned from each other. And I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunities in our lifetime to continue to work together more closely on issues that we care deeply about. So thank you, Sharon, for your
Absolutely.
support.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it.
Thank
Okay.
you,
Okay.
Mr. Powell.
All right, Dana, it's all you.
Move over. Come over here, Dana.
go have a cup of coffee. Yeah.
Sit in the back. Put his feet up.
You seem reluctant.
There we go. That'll be next time.
My allergies.
Thanks,
your-
bye.
You got all your stuff?
And while you're getting settled, Dana, just again, hopefully you all looked at the rest of the item, not just the election part of it. There is on page 3 an actual piece of paper that ideally, if you're confident today, you know what committees you'd like to be in and what you'd like to chair or vice chair, you could fill that out and give that to our new chair, Dana, or myself, and we'll collect them so that we can organize that. Oh, yeah, it's your digital. I'll get you one. Good point. Good point. Yeah, I forgot. I've got the hard copy. Yes, you're right. We'll get you a hard copy, and I'll put it out there later today in case if you're ready to move on that right away.
That way Sharon and I can take a look at
Danielle, I don't know if you heard that too.
Yep.
They are issue of digital, so do you mind printing that off later in the day and just letting everyone have that page? It's a TRB 7.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danielle. So I too would like to put my 2 cents in about the time that Harry's been our chair. It's been amazingly inspirational. I've loved to sit back and watch him. It's been great. You've handled us with grace, and don't go too far from your phone. I'll end it there because then we will need Kleenex.
I got it right here.
And I'm
Right
so looking forward to working with you.
Me too,
So it's
Dana.
gonna be exciting.
I can't wait.
Alrighty. So getting into the agenda then, and working with all of you too.
Chopped liver. Are they chopped liver?
There's no. On our website, we've had some materials that have been updated. So there was an updated PowerPoint for item number 5. That's the adoption of our valuations. And Ed sent us cash flow projections. Those are also available. And on number 11, the long-term facilities has a new write-up, and we have a hard copy of Board Ed, but it's also on the website to be downloaded if you want that digitally. And with that said,
We're back to the meeting calendar, just number 3.
we'll go back to calendar.
Yeah, can I do that one, Dan? Just because,
Please.
If you notice on the first paragraph, we do have one change, and that is originally we've been on this idea that each year you do the offsite at one of our new regional counseling centers. We've had trouble closing the lease on that San Diego property. It's not that it's going to get done, but it's been complicated with the company. So we're delayed in getting a lease done. We still don't have a completed lease. So what we do know for sure is it won't be done, the construction, all that you do, by the time you would have an offsite. So we just kind of took that off your plate. And Harry and Sharon suggested, because they had getting some ideas together around what would be a good offsite, but they suggested that we have it in the San Francisco area. And Danielle's done a nice job working with our staff on identifying a nice retreat center, actually, that's in the area, in the Palo Alto. And and I think it'd be a very nice setting, but it's also very accessible if you have guests coming from San Francisco that might be speakers or stakeholders. So it works out well from being remote, but also close to people's transportation patterns. But if you wanted to use that center, we would need your flexibility. If you could look at the actual physical calendar on TRB 10 on October, instead of it being on Thursday and Friday, which, and some of you weren't that crazy about Friday anyway, as an offsite day historically, we would need to do it on Wednesday and Thursday, which is the 19th and 20th. The facility's not available on Friday at all. Otherwise, we'd have to go into just a classic urban hotel in San Francisco. So if there's no objection to that, we'd like to let Danielle try and,
If they want to do.
it'd be
or
coming the night before
Paul
on the
driving
18th.
over.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I think I
19th
said
and
staff have a very favorable impression, the investment staff that have used the facility. So if that's not a big deal, we
That
would do
sounds
that.
fine. Anybody else? Jack,
Yeah.
we'll let people take a look in their calendars, see if there is a conflict. I have a couple other dates on the calendar that I have questions of. The March 2nd date, that is the annual CTA NEA-R conference. Were there any conflicts this year? I mean, because I think you spoke on Friday.
Yeah, that's why I missed one of the presentations, because at CTA, I didn't do it. Cassandra did it for me.
So I just wanted to bring that to everybody's attention in case
Yeah.
anybody wanted to attend that also. It runs Thursday night and then all day Friday and Saturday, right?
Is that the dates for 17?
I think so.
Yeah, if you're not familiar with what Dana was saying, that it really, actually, I think only you and maybe Harry have attended, but there's an annual conference that I do every year usually with Dana, of the CTA organization for retired people. But
That might be a date we don't even use, but in
yeah,
case
it's
we
a
did, I wanted
subcommittee,
you to
if
be
we still
aware of
have a
that.
subcommittee meeting at that time, yeah.
And then the date in June,
June.
that is the last week of school for me. And I think it's the last week of school for Harry, at least according to Santa Monica's calendar on their district site. Is there any way, that's a very problematic,
The 7, 8, 9 of June,
Mm-hmm.
17, okay?
after would be best,
Okay. How
if
about
that's
we-
possible. I don't know
Yeah.
when PERS meets in June.
Probably the best thing is maybe just to prove up to that date. We have to coincide it with holidays, religious holidays, other events. Yeah, all these are navigating a little gauntlet of conflicts. But I'll flag it. If you're comfortable with everything else, we'll just hold that one out, and I'll check back and make sure we're not infringing on somebody's time.
Thanks. Alrighty,
Okay?
Tom? You good?
Nothing to do about it, but the offsite date coincides with my daughter's due date. for her first child, so-
Oh, wow.
So it wouldn't much matter if we moved it one day or not. You're still,
There's
you're
no-
still-
There's no prediction, right?
No.
All right.
How exciting. Alrighty, is there any other questions on the calendar? Well, you've chimed in, but you're not coming up on my,
Oh, okay. Just that
Hang
I
on a
can't
second.
make the July meeting,
Okay.
And I can only make one day of the June thing, a Wednesday.
I don't know why this doesn't work.
June 17 for sure.
Okay. When we get close to those dates, if you could just remind us, that would be great.
And they have a conference December 8th for the subcommittee.
Okay.
Excuse me, I lost track. I've got meetings in June on,
June 17. Is that?
No, it's.
No, it's
Oh,
not
when
the
you say
17th,
17,
is
you're
it?
saying 2017, right?
Oh,
The
yeah.
date.
I'm looking at this.
Yeah.
Are you looking at 17 dates?
Yeah, we've already approved through June of this year. We're just doing 16, 17.
So we're holding off on next June.
Yeah, she was focused on June 2017, thank you.
Right.
Yeah, so I'll go back
Oh,
and
you just can't go to the July meeting like.
play with that.
In this couple months from now. Gotcha.
Okay.
I got the line.
All right. So this is, we do need to adopt this. I'd entertain a motion.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Any abstentions? We've passed the calendar then. So Ed, it's to you.
Sure. So we had five bills before you. There's been a lot of activity and in some cases inactivity since the board packet was put together. So I'll sort of go through where we are on things. The first two bills, AB 1551 and AB 1552, if you look at the matrix that we passed out, you'll notice it said pending referral to policy committee for both of those, and they were never referred to the policy committee. They're just stayed, and rules committee were never referred. So it's sort of like they're not going anywhere. So I really don't think it'd be any reason for the board to take a position on either one of those bills because they are not going to move forward.
Hold those over until there is
There,
something.
if they are, and trust me, at this point, I'm sure they're not. There's a lot of issues going on with around those bills. I really don't expect to have those bills heard. Similarly, AB 1812, the author has decided not to pursue that bill. So again, I don't think there's any reason that the board needs to concern itself with taking a position on that. So the first bill I want to talk about is Assembly Bill 1875. Which is it has to do with the option beneficiaries and allowing the designation of a special needs trust for an option beneficiary. And just to remind the board, members when they retire can elect to name a beneficiary to receive a benefit when the member dies. And under the law, the beneficiary actually has to be a real person so that we have a birth date associated with it. And there's an expectation that at some point the person dies and that benefit stops. Trusts are specifically not allowed because generally speaking, trusts can go on forever and there's no particular birth date associated with it. But there's a form of a trust called a special needs trust that people designate their particularly disabled children that resources can go into those trusts, and so they're shielded from counting against asset and income limits related to SSI and other social service programs. But in our program, since you're not allowed to name a trust as an option beneficiary, they can't name a special needs trust as an option beneficiary. This bill would let them do that. We've worked closely with the author's office to do language that makes sure it legally works. Protects the system as much as possible. When we presented when we prepared the analysis originally, there was just a lot of risk and a lot of manual process associated with it. The experience that other states have had in terms of having these kinds of trusts indicates that it's only a handful of people that would designate a trust. So it didn't seem it was worth it to automate the process, particularly in START. So it would be a manual process, and it would be, as I said, it would be very difficult and very risky. But since then, since the analysis was finalized, the staff have been working on it some more and sort of have come up with a workaround around it. So it's still clunky. I'm not going to suggest otherwise. There's less risk associated with continuing to pay a trust after the child has died. It's sort of like leaving it to the board. From our perspective, this is probably not going to be used very often, but if we can recognize it can be of great value to the individual family to allow this to happen. So if from the board's perspective, they would like to facilitate that kind of use, the staff can certainly make it work, and we would be comfortable with being neutral on the bill. But we want to make sure that you're aware of the fact it's not going to be the easiest thing for us to deal with, unlike managing, option beneficiaries generally where it's completely automated. This would be use some of the automation, but we'd have to sort of pay close attention to it. So, I don't think we're recommending oppose. We sort of leave it up to the board in terms of, as I said, if the board wants to allow members to name a special needs trust, we can certainly make it work, and we would be comfortable with the board being neutral on the bill.
Okay, I have a speaker, please. Go ahead, Grant.
Thanks, Ed. And you said you came up with some sort of a workaround? Could you explain that?
Yeah, essentially what it is we have mechanisms in survivor benefits which is when a member dies while still employed, and if there's no dependent parent or spouse and the child's name is the beneficiary, we have a mechanism start and we actually end up using a part of the start that's where there's a court-ordered deduction of a benefit, and we incorporate the benefit into that. And we would just do the same thing here. We would just have to make sure that when the member died, that there was a flag on the account so that so the staff would know to go look at the documentation to see that it's in fact being sent to a trust, and then we make the changes we need to do. Like I said, it's not the most elegant approach, but we can make it work, and we actually tested it yesterday, and it does work.
So the cost impact that you listed in the
That would
analysis,
depend if we automated it,
Okay,
but
so
we would use the existing, but we wouldn't change in the automation.
And does this require a change in the legislation that, like the current
No,
language? that
no.
is-
I mean, there's some technical amendments, but not related to making the process work. There's some other amendments that we've already given the authors to address final concerns. They had nothing to do with the particular approach that we take.
I guess I want to be cautious a little bit. You're talking a lot about the process and the administrative aspects of this, which are always relevant. But to me, they are the afterthought. I mean, the important thing is this good policy? Do you support it, and how does it intersect with your legislative position policy, which on the original draft, Brian, you have it there?
Yeah, the original draft, just from my position, I thought that your policy made it very clear that it would be one of those positions that you would oppose because it's basically benefits for a small group of people with a large outlay of expense, and very, very small benefit, very, very small population. I can't remember, it was less than a handful. So I wasn't aware of the workaround until today. I still think it fits under your policy. That is legislation that you would certainly not support. I think it increases, or it's a benefit just a small group of people. And that's, again, under your policy, that's a position you would normally oppose.
So I would focus on the policy side of it first, maybe, and then knowing that it could work
But
administratively.
just to clarify the policy, it also says it would be opposed unless it's correcting an inequity that the board perceives. So it's a question of whether you think there's an equity issue involved. That's all. But again, we're not recommending support by any stretch of the imagination. And it's certainly.
And we don't have to take a position.
You don't have to take a position. No, I mean, I guess it's a question of how you want us to proceed with respect to the legislature in terms of addressing the issue.
All right. Nora?
So have there been conversations with the author around, this administrative
Yes.
change versus the doing the legislation, and what are they?
Well, I mean, in terms of what the workaround issue, they wouldn't. I mean, that wasn't of any concern to them. I think they really want to know if the board's going to oppose the bill. I think they would reconsider whether or not they would pursue the bill. If the board is reasonably comfortable they're not opposing the bill, then my guess is they would pursue
But
it.
I'm saying if there is an administrative way of fixing this particular issue, then there may not be a need for this particular legislation. So that's why I'm asking.
Oh,
if there's
no,
a
well, they would
conversation.
need the legislation. To do the special needs trust, there would need to be legislation.
Okay.
Yeah, the only other alternative is what we mentioned in the analysis is the ABLE Act, which doesn't quite replicate what they do because it doesn't shield income, it only shields assets.
Okay.
So that would be the only other alternative, but they would need legislation one way or the other to do what they're trying to do here.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. Now, in reading this, and the write-up, Ed, you did talk about that it was being brought forth for a very small group. So I reached out to a friend of mine who has a daughter who's in her 20s, is dependent on him, and probably would benefit from something like this. And so I understand the impetus of being a small group, but I'm not sure we actually have an idea how many members it might actually impact. And having that conversation with him, there are several families here in Sacramento that the parents now are the sole providers and don't have siblings or that are going to be able to care for their children once they pass. And that has been of great concern to them. So I don't necessarily want to, I don't know how to put this first. If we oppose it and it passes, and it doesn't pass, then we've lost the ability to even do the workaround, correct?
We would, yeah, there wouldn't be any reason to do the workaround. Absolutely, yeah.
Brian?
I believe that what you're articulating is the inequity,
Right.
which is the other part, as Ed's pointed out, if rather than for you to oppose, if you see an inequity, then you could take a neutral position on it.
Grant?
So two things. So the development of the ABLE Act kind of falls under my bailiwick. It's not there yet. We're waiting for an appropriation. It's going to be a while. And you're right, Ed. It wouldn't do the same things as a special needs trust. And then the other thing, question for you, Brian, isn't our policy also to be neutral on benefit design changes, and would this fall under that?
It could.
Okay.
It could.
There's different ways to look at it.
That's all part of the discussion. It really is. I think the discussion for you is whether or not this is just benefiting a small number of people without any inequity, without addressing any inequity that would put you in the oppose camp, or whether or not you see an inequity and it was something you wanted to be neutral on.
I guess I'd be inclined to take a neutral position.
Savannah?
Yeah, I'm going to abstain from any vote on legislation, but I just wanted to ask a question so I understand what the policy is on the trust issue. So is it that we prohibit a trust from being named now because then the benefit would always have some ability to be passed on, right? There would be no sort of actuarial end to a benefit if you could name a trust.
Associated with a trust,
Yeah.
so we don't know how to reduce the member-only benefit to reflect
Which
a
means
person.
that the benefit could be passed on essentially forever, right?
And that would be one option.
So
That would be one possibility.
then the policy question here in terms of what the bill is proposing to do is whether this special needs trust is sufficiently different from another trust, right? That in terms of considering whether we would have a position on whether this is a good policy choice.
Right.
It's-
The actual
okay.
implications of a special needs trust is not a problem. It's because it's associated with a particular person. So
Yeah.
there's a birth date and there's a death at some point.
Yes, so there is a way, if you knew the universe and you knew,
Yes.
then you would still have a way to account for it
Yes.
actuarially about what the impact to
Yes.
the system is. Okay. Again, I'm not going to take a position on legislation, but I wanted to make sure I understood what the issue was. Thank you.
So Ed, would you rather, instead of having us take any type of position today, have this back in your shop and take a look at some of the implications to do a different kind of analysis? Or are you comfortable if we go with neutral today? If somebody
in
so
terms
moves?
of, well, just to clarify, what would we be looking at further? Just the administrative mechanism of it, or what?
Well, no, because I think, you've articulated the mechanism, but I guess, would we need any further analysis of what that population could be? I mean, that's highly speculative,
Yeah, I
but.
don't think we'd ever.
or
We know what the experience has been in other states. Colorado has this, and one of the states, and it's been a handful. We're a bigger state, so probably it's a bigger hand. But I mean,
Right.
that's probably about the extent of it. I don't think we would have any real way of knowing. But it's not going to be. It's not going to be a significant number of people.
Okay.
For sure. I'm
Then,
comfortable with
does
that.
anyone, we want to let it go? We want to take a position? Grant?
Is I would move to take a neutral position.
I would second that motion.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to take a neutral. Is there any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Any abstentions? We have 2 abstentions. Thank you very much. The motion passes. Okay, Ed, next one.
Assembly Bill 2155 is a bill having to do with community college faculty and adult education. The bill has been amended since this analysis came out, so it reflects the amendments that we were actually seeking. So essentially what the bill does now is that there are different minimum standards for determining service credit for different community college faculty depending upon whether or not they're full-time faculty, part-time faculty, or adult education faculty. And that determines how they accrue service credit and how their final compensation is determined. In the law, there is no definition of what adult education is in community college, so it's not clear which types of faculty are adult ed versus full or part-time. What this bill does now, is basically allows the collective bargaining agreement to designate which courses are adult education for purposes of reporting to us so that we know which standard applies in that case. That approach addresses the concern that the sponsors are trying to accomplish with respect to these particular sets of classes. And with that, it mitigates the concerns that we had around what was being proposed originally in terms of having to do this comparison of benefits that we do now under other circumstances, which is a huge administrative practice that we don't really like. So based on the current version of the bill, we would recommend neutral on the bill.
All right, is there any? Sharon?
I'm just going to abstain since it's my local that's putting the bill for us, so.
All righty, anyone else? All righty, and that's a neutral? All in favor, we need anybody care to move staff's recommendation?
Move staff recommendation.
Second.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Any abstentions? All right, that passes as a neutral. Thank you, Ed.
Sure. And then finally, there's a number of bills that you'll see that we're going to be preparing to present to the board in June. So I think there's maybe about 7 bills, or maybe even more than that you can see on the matrix. A couple of bills that you've seen before in a different form. One of them having to do with divestment from investments in Turkey is back. And then there's some other new ones in there. One bill that's on the list, it's Senate Bill 1390 by Senator Block, had to do with an exemption from the earnings limitation for the first 180 days. And even though the bill was amended to do that, they've now decided not to pursue the bill, so we won't be presenting that to the board next month. The other thing I wanted to bring to your attention was H.R. 711, a federal bill having to do with the WEP, the windfall elimination provision, which is something that all teachers are extremely familiar with. There was a hearing in the Ways and Means Subcommittee on Social Security last month on the issue, and Harry, as chair of the board at the time, submitted testimony expressing our views around the bill and around the issue itself. And according to John Stanton, it was somewhat of a love fest in the committee, and he actually feels that there may actually be a good opportunity to enact the bill this year. It's reflected in the president's budget, as well as some changes to the government pension offset. But just to remind the board, there were some concerns that the board had expressed with the bill because it would have extended a different calculation of an offset, but an offset even for teachers who never qualified for a benefit. That's apparently remaining in the bill. It's a way of paying for it, but we made sure that concern was expressed to the committee in the testimony that was presented to them. But as I said, they do feel, and John feels, that this is actually probably the best opportunity in 25 years to actually do something with the WEP, and perhaps even with the GPO. So I would also make sure that the board is aware of that. But with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions around any of the other legislation.
Any questions? Ed, if you could go through the first few that we had, the 2 Allen bills are being held.
Yes, so they are not being referred. They were not referred to the policy committee, so they won't be pursued in the legislature.
And the Wagner bill?
Wagner bill, again, the author decided not to pursue that bill.
Thank you. Any other questions? Alrighty, thank you, Ed. Oh,
Can I
hang
just
on.
say one thing? Sorry.
Go ahead, Sharon.
So I just assume Ed will keep our members apprised of this federal legislation since it's something that
Yes.
people ask about all the time, so we'll have some kind of,
On the
when there's
HR 711?
right.
Yes.
When there's some kind of news
Yes.
that passes,
And
we'll
we
send
actually
something out to members, educating them in layman's terms what
Yeah.
that means for their life.
Yeah, and we actually posted the testimony, the statement that we sent to the committee is on our website, so, but we will certainly keep it updated.
Alrighty, thank you.
And I do want to weigh in on that.
Sure. Go ahead, Harry.
There is AB 283.
283?
2833.
2833.
Oh, 283.
Cooley bill?
Yes.
The Cooley bill that our state treasurer has taken the leadership on. I do want to acknowledge Treasurer Chung on his leadership on this issue to adopt some type of meaningful change and reform around disclosure and transparency. I know it's going to be a difficult needle for people to thread, but I do believe it's possible. I just want to commend the treasurer for his efforts to bring some light to this issue that has certainly gotten a lot of discussion, and to find the right compromise and resolution and appropriate reform and change, I think is probably the best chance that we have. And I just want to acknowledge the treasurer's efforts. And I know our staff is working with the treasurer's office to find a way in which we can walk alongside one another to support meaningful legislation.
Yeah, we are continuing to work with the treasurer's office on that, and we'll be presenting to the board in June.
Grant?
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you, Harry, for your support. And yes, we've been working with CalSTRS staff and CalPERS staff, along with the author's office, and I believe it'll be in print fairly soon, and the first policy committee hearing is, let's say it's set for the 20th? Yep,
Or 21st, yeah. it's
Very
the
20th, I believe.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Alrighty. Jennifer? Do we throw the timer up for, it's a public comment, but it's not the end of the meeting.
She'll be the first test.
I'm sure you heard that
Let's
already.
see what
though.
happens.
And I know you can be very
Is there
succinct,
a
so.
big buzzer?
It's on. It's on.
You're gonna be demonstrating good.
Yeah, really.
It hasn't started.
Good morning, Jennifer Baker, the California Teachers Association. I actually wanted to thank Ms. Hendricks for her comments on federal legislation, and to thank CalSTRS staff for doing a good job on reaching out to us regarding changes and discussions happening regarding federal bills. We've actually been utilizing resources that CalSTRS has provided, and we've been sharing that with our national affiliates and National Education Association to do what we can organizationally to disseminate that information, because exactly what you were saying, it's very hard for people to understand what's happening. We're trying to do what we can, but really wanted to thank CalSTRS staff, therefore the board, for doing an excellent job trying to make sure that organizations are aware of what's going on.
Super. Look at that. You had minutes to spare. Thanks,
It's
Jennifer.
not her first rodeo.
Yeah, that's right.
She knows what she's doing.
Good modeling. Good modeling. Oh, you can't carry it over?
No.
Can't give it to somebody else?
No, you
Dang. You guys are
Use it or
tough.
lose it.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Mr. Boykin says there's 3 minutes for the week.
There you go. There you go. All righty. So Rick and David and Nick, come on forward, and we'll talk about our valuations. Thanks again.
Okay, good morning, Madam Chair. Congratulations again on becoming chair. Condolences also. We're here to present the results of the evaluation. Nick is here again. I think for some of the new board members and people who haven't been around a while, this has been a long process to get funding. It's been over 10 years. I think formally we've asked the legislature to legislate for 10 years, but since I think 2001, we've been asking for more contributions. We finally have them. It will be a long process. We didn't funded overnight, it'll be a long process. So it will be years before there will really be significant progress. So we have to be patient and let the funding kick in and let the markets work. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nick, who's going to present the results of the valuations this year.
Thanks, Rick. Well, I guess congratulations. It's deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra would say. So my 3 minutes started? Okay. First of all, Mark sends his apologies. Our second favorite client scheduled their board meeting in Austin at the same time, and he could not be in two places at once. But he was obviously actively involved in the process. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to lead off with the DB program. We really kind of have a little bit of a breather this year. Last year, we spent a lot of time incorporating the funding legislation and the valuation, and we gave you a little education on that. Next year, we actually see the funding legislation kick in when we see the new rates being implemented. For this year, as I said, just really no huge surprises. I just want to go over kind of the key results. As you can see up there, the funded ratio remained at 68.5% this year, the same as last year. And that kind of goes back to what Rick said about it being a long process. Unless Chris is going to, get us 25% next year, and then I can promise you we can speed it up. But barring that, we expect it to slowly materialize. And in fact, we actually project small decreases as the contribution rates slowly grade up, and then we would project increases in the funded ratio. But there are other things going on. In this case, we had some small gains flowing through actually pretty significant gains flowing through in our smoothing method, and that kind of offset the underfunding level. And after all the years of us saying, hey, you needed more money, now we're saying you're getting more money, and as of right now, that's the projected money that you need. After kind of going over the key results, then we kind of want to lay the groundwork for the state contribution, because that's going to be really the big change next year when the state contribution goes to a variable level. And lastly, we want to look forward a little bit what we might expect in the future. Once again, for all time's sakes, we have our projected funded ratio. And what you see is, I alluded to it, really not much change between this valuation, the blue line there, and the green valuation, last year's valuation. We're projected to move up towards 100% in about 2046. So that looks real good. And as I said, for all time's sakes, we've left our ugly red line, which is now red this year. I think it was blue last year, and the red was going up. So we've rectified that, showing where we would be without the legislation, which wasn't a pretty picture. As you know, probably our key measurement that we look at for funded health is the funded ratio. We combine all the key components of the valuation, the data, the assets, the plan provisions, and the assumptions, and we put it through our actuarial software, do our calculations, and you can see the results here. What you see is the actual obligation increased from $231 million to about $242 million, 4.6% increase. The actual value of assets increased from 158 to about 165 billion, also about a 4.5% increase. And not surprisingly, since both those changed about 4.5%, the unfunded actual obligation increased by about 4.5%, and increased by about 4.5%. And as Rick alluded to, this long process, we're going to see it go up, and we'll show a little projection of the unfunded actual obligation. We expect it to go up before it starts coming down, and that leaves us to our bottom line funded ratio of 68.5%. Just want to touch briefly on the key components of the evaluation. One is the census data. Really, your data is very consistent with a mature plan, is consistent from year to year. One of the consistency was actually a little bit inconsistent, which is we actually saw the average earned salary go up by 3.7%, which is almost exactly our assumption, which I can't remember when the last time I was actually able to say that. And that's actually, it's a bad thing for funding a pension plan, and that, you have more benefits to pay, but but also it's a good thing because you have a greater payroll, and that combined with this 2% increase in your active count meant your total payroll goes up 5.7%. And since you've got contribution rates that are fixed as percentages and then become variable, having a higher payroll that you're collecting those contributions on is a good thing, and it had a slightly positive effect on our valuation results. Actual assumptions, no changes here. Obviously, the key one being the investment return of 7.5%. Likely, we will see changes next year. We'll have an experience study between now and the next valuation we expect. But no changes obviously reflected in this valuation, and no changes in the plan provisions either. Obviously, we've got more 2% at 62 people working their way into the system, so they will slowly be recognized, but obviously no other outside changes in the provisions. Actual value of assets, as you're aware, we use a smoothing method. That means that even though the market return was about 4% last year, we only recognize 1/3 of that, and as you're aware, that 4% in actual reward falls short of a 7.5%, so we call that actual loss, even though the fund did make around 4%. But once we crank it through our smoothing method, we had that very good return for the fiscal year ending 2014. On an actual basis, the assets go up 8.6%. And your actual value of assets and your market assets are pretty close right now, with your market assets about $3.6 billion greater, so that's kind of a small deferred gain that will work its way through our smoothing method over the next few years. And this is just numerically what I already talked about, is how your funded ratio changed from year to year, which it didn't change this year. You see that we would have expected it to go down by 0.7% due to underfunding. And if you remember, this is back for the fiscal year beginning 2014 to 2015, those contribution rates, which is just when the graded contributions start to increase. So as we go in the next few years, this should go from negative to positive, and it should have a positive impact, the additional funding. That was offset by the asset gain or loss, which was overall was a gain on an actual basis. As I said, you earned 8.6%, greater than the 7.5% assumption, even though the current year was actual loss, and that dropped the funded ratio about 0.9%. The prior year's gains working their way through increased it by 1.6%, which exactly offset. All of the other assumptions were pretty much spot on. You can credit that to great actual work or random luck, but we're looking good there, and we're at 68.5%. Now I just want to talk about CalSTRS 2% of 62 members, because even though the member rate is fixed, it can possibly change if the normal cost rate changes significantly. It was initially set at the member rate at half of the normal cost rate, which was around 16%. The normal cost rate, as we've had a few more people, is a little bit lower, and is now 15.672% for the 2% at 62 members. And I've got sort of the limitations in the rules about how it changes and when we make the change. And bottom line is no change, so the base rate stays at 8%. There's also an additional supplemental piece, which means the 2% of 62 members will be contributing 9.205% for the fiscal year beginning 2016. And I think they're going to need to ultimately adopt the normal cost rate. And obviously, no change is recommended in the member rate. Funding sufficiency. So this is obviously one of the things in the past, which is we've had a real issue here, and that we haven't had sufficient contribution rates. Now we've reflected the funded legislation, and what you see is basically what we do is we calculate the normal cost rate, so that's how much needs to be contributed to cover the value of the benefits being earned during the year, and then with the amortization rate needed, so that's the contribution rate needed to fund the unfunded actual obligation. So that's about 18% and about 13%. So you have about 31% that you need. And what we're showing here is the equivalent contribution right now is 33.4%. And that is sort of a hypothetical, is if there was no changes in the contribution rates once they reach their ultimate level. And we wanted just to show that as kind of a barometer of whether we expect contribution rates to go up or down. Under an actuarial funded contribution rate, you would expect the contribution rate to adjust to equal what the rate that is needed. So theoretically, that equivalent contribution rate, if we reflected future changes, should be at about 31.1%, similar to the rate needed. But we do have, right now, the ultimate rates are a little bit higher than we need by about 2.3%. So we would expect overall the contribution rates coming in would decrease by about 2.3%, all other things being equal. So I didn't want to, last time we spent a lot about the 4 valuations we do and all the hypothetical numbers we come up with to kind of make this whole thing work. Didn't want to go into too much detail on that this time, but I did want to just remind you of kind of the key points of the new funding. First of all is that the progress on the funding ratio is going to take time due to the graded increases. Asset gains could speed this up or losses could slow that down. Good returns are going to have a significant impact on the state supplemental rate, and bad returns obviously would be the flip side. The member rate, the member rates are not going to change because they are not contingent on the funded rate, on the funding of the system. The employer rates will change, but they will change up or down, and they will change at a much smaller magnitude. And I'll show you a couple of projections, and you'll see how the state rate is going to move a lot greater than the employer rate. Lastly, one thing we've talked about is sort of the orphan portion, which is the new benefits for post-2014 service. This was not specifically addressed in the funding legislation, so we have allocated a certain amount to fund those benefits, and we, as of 2014, we kind of set it up so if everything went according to plan, it would follow. Because the fiscal year 2015 return was just slightly below, there's now going to be a very small sliver of this unfunded for this orphan piece, and I'm going to show you a graph, and you'll see kind of put that into perspective. Supplemental contribution rates, obviously, as I said, member rates don't change. The member have the supplemental contribution rates that grade up, and those are fixed. But the state supplemental contribution rate will change effective with the 2016 valuation, or at least the board will have. The board has the rate setting authority on that, which would be effective July 2017. Similarly, for the employer supplemental piece, that grades up at a longer period of time, and that would be effective with the 2020 valuation, effective July 2021. Just to remind you, these are hypothetical calculations done that we put in the report. We put some numbers there just to kind of give you an idea of where it would be, and I'm going to go over the state one a little bit more detail because that's coming up next year. But obviously, these rates are just informational purposes only. As I said, the state contribution rate, I wanted to talk about that first because that's the one that's coming up in the short term. What we have to do to calculate that is first we have to calculate the 1990 structure unfunded actual obligation. And this is no different than, as far as the calculation of the UAO, is no different than what we've been doing for years. We've basically said, what if the benefit increases didn't happen? What if contribution rates didn't change from the 16%? And we calculate assets and liabilities based upon that. And we're going back to kind of recreate where exactly we would have been as best as we can. For example, one of the key things is if the benefits weren't increased, people would have, retirees right now would have lower benefits, and therefore the retiree actual obligation would be less. And that's one of the reasons the actual obligation is a lot less under the 1990 benefit structure at about $197 billion versus the total fund, which is about $242 billion. And the assets would have been greater because we wouldn't have been paying those higher benefits. The assets would have been about $183 billion versus the about $166 billion that is the actual value of assets for the DB program right now. And bottom line, you see we've got about a $14 billion unfunded actual obligation. And on the next page, we'll kind of go through how we would calculate the rate or how we will do that in the next valuation. So for the state supplemental contribution rate, first thing we need to do is figure out what the total revenue needed to pay this, the 1990 unfunded, which is, I've got the mathematical formula there, but basically what we're trying to do is we're saying, hey, we know there's going to be payroll over the next 30 years through 2046, and we're going to need to assign a fixed percentage of that payroll as contributions that are going towards paying that unfunded liability, and that's what that formula is doing. So that tells us, as you can see in the chart down below, we need 2.7% of payroll dedicated to pay the 1990 unfunded. But we also know that under the 1990 structure, the contribution rate was 8% for members and 8% for employers, so it was 16% of pay. That compares to the normal cost for the 1990 structure, which was 15.3%. So you already had about 0.7%, which was available to fund the UAO. So the state effectively has to make up the difference, which is the 2.7 minus 0.7, which is about a 2%. So that would mean if the valuation was done, if this was the rate setting valuation, we would recommend that the state rate be lowered by about 2%. And if you think back to that contribution sufficiency graph I said, we had about a 2.3% surplus, and that's kind of consistent. We expect about a decrease of about 2% as of right now. So that's kind of the key points of the valuation of where we're at, and now I'm going to look forward a little bit. This is sort of our perfect world scenario showing the contribution rate. So that is, we assume 7.5% each year. The red line there is the state rate, and we show sort of the scheduled rate, which is the ultimate rate before the adjustable rates come in. And my understanding is there's some consideration that the state may pay the maximum of the adjustable rate. The adjustable rate is assuming paying off the unfunded till 2046, and the state may want to pay off at a quicker rate, and they might keep at that 4.311%. And as you see, then you see the decreases, which is consistent with what we're talking about, is that we're projecting a decrease in the rate. And I should add that the numbers are that first year, the decrease about 2017, it's about 4%, which is the 2.017 base state rate plus the 2% rate that I showed on the last page. And so we would expect it to decrease slightly and just go down a little bit more as the small deferred gain works its way through. The member rate is the blue line, and you see just a small decrease in that, and that's just because the 2% at 60 members pay a little bit more than the 2% at 62 members. So as you get more 2% at 62 members, the overall rate is going to go down, but it's not that the individual member rates are changing. The employer rate, you see, is the green one there. And what you see is the once again, kind of consistent with that message that we've given is the state rate has moved significantly, and the employer rate is pretty much still on target with what our projected rate, the initial rate was. And lastly, the purple rate is just the total rate of all stakeholders combined. So here's where we try to isolate the individual pieces that we're paying off, and the pre-2014 service of new benefits. That's effectively what the employer is trying to fund, that unfunded unfunded actual obligation. The red is the state piece, and back when the funded legislation originally started, that red piece was bigger, and then last year when we came to talk to you, it was projected to be even smaller than this, and now it's somewhere in the middle, and you see it starts out about $13 billion and gets paid off, but it's obviously significantly less than the green piece. And The one point I wanted to make also was you can see that blue sliver if you look real closely, and that's kind of our orphan piece of the actual obligation. It's not a big deal right now. It's something we'll want to monitor. And just the one little byproduct of that is, if you remember, we're trying to actually funding, so we're targeting 100%. So if all our calculations go, according to plan, we should really be hitting 100%. But we're not going to exactly hit 100% because that one little piece is not actually funded. So if you see in 2046, there's a very small piece. We would project the funded ratio was 99.7%. So we're still, on target, but there's just going to be that little discontinuity between perfect actuarial funding and what we actually have. Next, we know that this fiscal year so far, returns have not been great. Relative, just because the markets have been down, all my clients are sort of in a similar situation. It's not 2008, 2009, but obviously we're down a little bit. So we just wanted to give you an idea of what that impact of a less than expected return would have. We've used a 0% return, which I think is a pretty reasonable estimate where we are today of what possibly the return could be for fiscal year ending 2016. And you compare that back to the prior projection of contribution rates, and you see the state rate still is projected to go down in the first year, but as the actual loss from the return less than assumed in this year, the projected year, flows through, you actually see the rates would actually move up right to about where they would have been otherwise. So just that 1 year obviously has a pretty significant impact. And once again, you see it's the state rates that move the most significantly. And once again, this assumes 0% in the next year, but 7.5% each year going forward, and assumes no change in assumptions. And obviously, with an experience study coming up, there could be some changes there.
Collier?
Yeah.
Something keeps running through my mind during your presentation, and I'm not sure whether or not it's relevant, but I want to ask. When you look at all of these numbers, mortality plays an important factor in all of this, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, underlying all these assumptions is what's the current assumed mortality for that you're using?
Yeah.
What numbers life expectancy being?
Well, what we do is there's been a lot of movement, and these guys can speak to it too, in our profession and what appropriate mortality is. It used to be everybody just said, you just come up with some assumption, which may have been people are going to live to 85. But there's been a move to what's called generational mortality, which was more flexible, and then people who were born in 1960 are going to live longer than people who live in 1940. And if I had a son, I have a daughter, but she's going to live longer than my wife is generational. So it's more of a flowing thing. But to get what we've done to sort of approximate that, because there were some limitations from administrative purposes, is that we have your current retirees. We basically set their assumption based on the experience that we've had over the few years with a little bit of margin. And so what we've found over the last few years it's a pretty good assumption, but it's slowly as people are living longer, it's slowly our little margin is slowly getting deteriorated. But the key point is that for the people who are active right now, we basically expect them to live 2 years longer than people who are retired. So we do have a little bit of margin that goes through. But to give you kind of a number, the people who are retiring, people who are active right now, I think are projected, if they retire at 62, are projected to live like 89. Right? Yes. So it's a pretty long life expectancy, but given changes in life expectancies, that's definitely something we want to look at closely with the experience study.
Yeah, so not anything we need to settle today, but I think worthy of our consideration, thinking long-term, is just the role that advancements in medicine and health, along with how the teaching profession may or may not evolve. Probably certainly a longer conversation and not appropriate for today, but I think it's something that we need to be sensitive to in terms of what the teaching workforce may look like 30 years from now, 20 years from now, and what the advancements in medicine and the cost of some of this innovation is being driven down so dramatically, where what used to be prohibitive in terms of healthcare issues are now the costs are being driven down so rapidly that the average person is going to have potentially access to knowledge about their own individual health that can transform how long they actually live dramatically, potential, which could therefore affect what we do. But that's not for today. It's just something I think we need to be sensitive to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough call, and that's why we tried to, when we look at that, we'll try to build in some appropriate margin to take that into account as much as we can reasonably, foresee as well as anyone.
We have a couple other people, Nick.
Okay.
Grant?
Thank you. Just to follow up on Harry's question, so when Mr. Lamoureux in his old job helped a board come to the decision to adopt mortality improvement assumptions that were, I think, more conservative or more, expected longer life expectancies, and it was dynamic. And I think it was sort of a response to the actuarial industry best practices. And I'm just wondering, how do CalSTRS assumptions compare, with the assumptions adopted across the river? And is it time to look at those again?
So I can speak to that. And again, you got to keep in mind that you're looking at two different populations. So teachers have always lived longer than the general population. And if you look at CalPERS, actually, and even today, if you look at the assumptions used by both systems, Nick referred to that for current retiree, about 89 for the active, about 87 for current retirees. You're looking at something 2 to 3 years less for CalPERS, even with all of the margin that the CalPERS board adopted. And again, it was a reflection of the fact that just teachers on average live much longer than the rest of the population. CalPERS did adopt a fairly hefty margin, but if you look at the margin that are in place here today, I think overall the margins are even greater in place than what they are at CalPERS. But I don't think you should ever look at the life expectancies of the two groups and thinking that they should be the same, because they should be different.
Yeah, I just concur with what David said.
And I seem to recall when we had a conversation maybe last year about our mortality tables, we were talking about using our own population as a basis to build our mortality tables, correct, Rick?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. All right.
Yeah, and usually actuaries just use some standard tables because they don't have a big enough population to get meaningful data. But for CalSTRS, that's not the case. We do have meaningful data.
Super. Paul?
Yeah, about a year ago, I think you did a little bit of work on the sensitivity of longevity assumptions. When we discussed this at the ARM committee, and as I recall, maybe this could be redistributed to the full board, but it didn't show actually that there was that much sensitivity to our the funded status. I don't know if you remember the results of that analysis.